Okay, hi everyone. Very good evening. Sorry for all that technical glitch in the meantime that kept you waiting. Uh, can anybody just say on the chat if I'm audible and if you're able to see my screen properly now? Is things already at your end? Are you able to receive it? You can just say it on the chat. That will help. Okay, thank you, Kushu, for saying that. Uh, all right. So basically, the topic that we'll be talking about today is around breaking the myth and scoring an exemption in law and audit. Now, it is a very established kind of a fact, जो कि हम सब लोग को ही लगता है that it is very difficult to score an exemption in law and audit. So whenever you see anybody who's talking about the CA final examinations, everybody says that I will try and score an exemption in the other practical subjects, and in subjects में बस 40 pass होके I'll make my aggregate. So I think that particular approach is something which has been so much prevalent in the last few years that अभी हम लोग we don't even aim to score an exemption in these subjects. But my personal experience says that we can actually score really good marks in both of these subjects by just changing a few of the basics and not doing anything much. So brief introduction about myself. My name is Suryansh Agarwal. I was the AIR-1 in the CA final examination, and the scores that I have in law and auditing are 83 and 77. So 83 in law and 77 in auditing. So I think it is very much possible, as I can say from my own experience, that we can very well score an exemption in both of these subjects. So I'll just pick each of these subjects one by one, and then I'll just walk you through some of the important tips that you need to consider that will significantly move your overall marks from let us say 50, 60 to 70. So for audit, the first and the foremost thing that we need to be aware about is that in fact for any other subject also, it is basically a three-step process that we have. So the first and the most important thing is the right way to read when you're studying. The second thing is around think, and the third thing is around writing, right? Uh, so let us pick reading for example. So when I say that there has to be a right way of reading the audit as a subject, so I'm trying to imply that you should always know that what is it that you're reading. So a lot of time it happens that we keep on reading. Let us say we are reading a particular standard of auditing, and there will be a lot of places where you'll just go on reading a lot of things, but you won't even know what is it exactly that you're trying to read, and asking yourself again and again ki what is the topic that I'm reading currently. That will help you to bifurcate between the various topics that are there in this particular subject. So I'll give an simple example of it. So we need to understand when we are reading or when we are studying that uh, questions around objectives of a particular thing. So these are all different things, but a lot of time the mistake that we do is we consider all of these terms to be same as each other. So whenever we see a question around objectives of ABC, or let us say requirements of ABC or factors affecting ABC, our answer remains the same in all these cases. And that is the biggest mistake that we do. So, and that is basically because we do not read about these terms, but an entire focus is on the ABC concept that is being asked. So there are a lot of questions that can be asked around a single concept. So for a particular concept, there may be question around its objectives, there may be question around its requirements, there may be questions around the nature of that particular thing, about the components of that particular thing, the process around that thing. So the most important thing when you're reading your examination paper, or when you're studying for when you're preparing and you're studying, is to focus on these words as to what is it that you're actually reading about, and what is it that the actual question is asking you to. So there are a lot of instances when, let us say, the question is asked you to state the factors affecting a particular thing, but you have actually written the objectives of that particular thing or the nature of that particular thing. So in that case, you tend to lose entire 4 marks of that particular question, because you have not able to get the gist of the question itself correct. So it is very important to understand that all of these things are different from each other, and it is very important to read the word before the actual concept that is being asked. So if you are asking a particular concept, then before that what is being asked around that concept, that also has to be read with utmost care and importance. Now I'll give you a simple example. So this is around one of the most common uh, essays around audit documentation, essay 230. So let us see, if I'm saying that when I'm studying audit documentation for the first time, or let us say when I'm revising it a day before examination, I should focus on not only the part that is given to the right side of these lines, that is the various provisions that I need to know, but I should equally focus on the headings that are given on the left side of this page. So, for example, if somebody asks me in a question that what is the meaning of audit documentation, then I need to know that what exactly does an audit documentation mean? What is the definition of the audit documentation as has been defined by the particular standard? But again, this will be very different from the answer that you'll have to write in case it asks you about the nature of audit documentation. So for instance, the nature. Now, when I say a nature of a particular thing, it basically tells me that the document should be in the form that it acts as a sufficient and appropriate record of the basis of auditor's report, and that it should act as an evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with the essays and the regulatory requirements. So that is the nature of your audit documentation. That is not the factors for this audit documentation. That is not the meaning of audit documentation. So the meaning of audit documentation is very different from the nature of such audit documentation. Now, the next very common mistake that a lot of people do is that when it talks about factors of a particular thing, so all they remember is that in this particular standard 230 there was a topic around factors. Now you need to know कि हम किस चीज के factors की बात कर रहे हैं. So there could be factors which will affect the audit documentation in general. There may be some of the factors which may specifically affect the form, the content, and the extent of the audit documentation. So you need to be very, very careful that if you are being asked about what are the various factors which are affecting the form, content, and extent of the audit documentation, आपको ये बताना पड़ेगा कि in order to maintain this audit documents, while I'm maintaining that, I need to be careful about the size and the complexity of the entity. I need to be careful about the nature of the procedures that I've performed, because the form and the extent of my audit documentation will differ basis these factors. But again, if you write something like what is the purpose of the audit documentation or what is the content of the audit documentation, that will not serve the purpose of the question. So first and the most important thing is to read these terms which are given along with the headings that we say, and not to get confused among these terms, because a lot of time you may think that a nature of a particular thing and the purpose of a particular thing may be the same thing, but that's not always so. So a nature is basically the very essence why that thing exists, but the purpose of that could be what exactly is the use of that particular audit documentation. So why do we actually use audit documentation? So we use audit documentation for all of these things. But if I'm having an audit documentation, so the nature is the basic requirement कि ये तो होना ही चाहिए, मतलब it should always act as a sufficient and appropriate record of the basis of auditor's report. मतलब that तो should be there, but again it will also help me in achieving these other purposes that are being mentioned over here. So whenever you're reading a particular thing, and this is very true, especially in case of standards of auditing only. So other topics such as the company audit, or let us say tax audit for that instance, or if I say even professional ethics. So in those topics, this won't be that much of an issue. But this particular type of confusion is very, very prevalent when you're studying the standards on auditing. And this is something we should always focus, not only while you're reading, but also while you're reading the question in the examination center. Okay, now the second part around the three-step process is around thinking. So once you have read the question, once you have read the concepts and you know the difference between all of these terms, the second thing and the most important thing is to give some amount of thinking before you are actually started to write your answer. So this will really help you to save a lot of time in the examination. So the most important piece of tip over here is that the first 15 minutes of your reading time, they have to be utilized very wisely. Do not make the mistake of reaching to the examination hall late or skipping those 15 minutes of reading time as not being essential, and do not waste that time. Use that very, very wisely to get an overall structure and start thinking about the answers that you want to write in the next 3 hours, so that in the next 3 hours you don't have to spend a lot of time in thinking and formulating answers, but rather you can capitalize on merely writing the answers and presenting them in a manner that will help you fetch good marks. So use the 15 minutes of reading time wisely. And the second thing is, before you are starting to write any particular question, just take 2 to 3 seconds of time and structure it. So why structuring a particular thing is so important is that a lot of time it happens that we'll notice that in a 3 to 4 marks question, like there's a standard 4 marks question that we get. So a lot of time it happens that in the 4 marks question, the mistake that we do is uh, that we write 2 or 3 pages without knowing the direction that we are going into. So in order to avoid that, it is very important to take 2 seconds of your time and structure how exactly are you going to write your answer and then write on it. So that is again an important piece of advice. Now the third and the most important thing which is there in order to score good in auditing examination is to write to make it right. Now, what I mean is that while you're writing an examination, while you're writing your audit examination, it is very important to use the right vocabulary. Now, by vocabulary, I do not mean English vocabulary. So it is okay if you make some basic English grammatical errors, that is acceptable. But what is not acceptable and what should be avoided by you, the first should be to avoid is that you use the right audit vocabulary. Now, what is this audit vocabulary? So there's no specific set of rules that we have for audit vocabulary, but again, there are a lot of things which are commonly accepted and it is always being said in a particular manner that will help you to get the overall understanding of how you have to present your vocabulary. So I'll give you a small example. So this is a list that I prepared while I was preparing for my examination, and it gives me a base as to what is the right kind of terminology that I have to use with each of these terms. So I'll read it out to you for instance. So first thing is financial statements. Now, if I have somebody who is saying that uh, the company is responsible for preparation and presentation of financial statements, now that is using the right vocabulary. Alternatively, from a meaning point of view, you can always say that it is good to make financial statements, it is good to write financial statements, even though that may sound correct, but again, it is not the most appropriate audit vocabulary in use. Right. Similarly, if I talk about audit evidences, then instead of using things like good audit evidences or correct audit evidences, it is always better to say that we have to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences. Now a lot of people would say कि ये तो हो गया कि मेरे को सब कुछ रट के जाना पड़ेगा, I have to mug up the entire thing, but ऐसा नहीं है. So if you go through your entire audit subject, which is such a vast subject, उसके अंदर से if you prepare this kind of a list ना, so you'll only be able to prepare 1 or 2 pages of these lists, which is broadly this, and इसमें कुछ आप थोड़ा बहुत add कर सकते हो. So these are the very basic terms जो कि आप across auditing subject अलग अलग chapters में use करोगे. This will be something which will be used across all the different essays, and a lot of times you will come across these terms such as auditor's opinion. So whenever you have to write anywhere about audit opinion, it is always good to say that an audit opinion should be formed and it should be expressed instead of that the auditor should give his audit opinion. So even though auditor should give his audit opinion is grammatically correct, it is completely fine, but in order to make a good impact in the mind of the examiner who's reading your answer, it is always better to say that the auditor's opinion should be formed and expressed in a particular manner. So similarly, if you look at this list, there will be a lot of such small terms. And once you read through this list now, it will not be very difficult for you to mug up all these terms because that is not required. What is required is to keep using these terms continuously so that ये आपके इतने grip में आ जाएगा कि whenever you have to say anything about auditor's report, you will always say that an auditor's report is issued. You will never say that the auditor's report is being written or an auditor's report is given. You won't say words like that. You will always say that an auditor's report is issued, or you will always say that there are some material misstatements that exist. You will not say that there is a error, there is a fraud. Instead of using that word fraud and error, we can always use material misstatement as a collective term for these two. So this kind of vocabulary you need to be very comfortable with while you're attempting your audit answer, so that you make a very positive impact in the mind of the examiner, and again it will help to enhance the overall value of your answer. Each and every answer, the value will be very much enhanced by using these kind of terms, and these are not very difficult to remember. You don't have to mug up the whole thing, but if you keep using these terms, your answer would anyway sound a lot more professional than anybody else's. So keep this point in mind. Now the next thing is around a basic presentation criteria as to how do you actually have to present your answers. So there are two samples that I have over here. One is the correct one, the other is the wrong one. So as you can see, it is very easy to understand that while you're writing a particular answer, just be as clear as you can, because again we all know that there is a given time frame within which your answer sheet has to be evaluated. So the easier you make it for the evaluator to evaluate, the better it is, right? So if there are two parts to a particular question, it's always better to highlight part A, part B, and write things in a point form or a bulleted form. So do not give numbers 1, 2, 3 over here. Simply use a line bullet or a dot bullet. That will serve your purpose, because additional numbering would cause further more confusion. So try to avoid that. And a wrong approach would be to write a big paragraph wherein second part is covered somewhere at the front, the first part is covered in the last. So even though you have given exactly the same content in both of these examples, but again the overall impact that you will have will be different. If I get a sheet like this and I don't have a lot of time to evaluate them, I may move on by giving 2 marks to this answer and 4 marks to this answer, right? Okay. Uh, so now some of the entire auditing syllabus that we have, it can be broadly divided into these four categories. So one would them would be standards of auditing. So some of the tips that I want to share with respect to this is, first and foremost, is to read the correct term with respect to the standards of auditing, like I discussed earlier. कि क्या पूछना चाह रहा है? Is it asking the nature? Is it asking the objective? Is it asking the factors which is affecting it? Is it asking the meaning of a particular term which has been defined by any standard? So it's always better to read that. Second thing, for standards of auditing, it is always preferable if you quote the name and the standard number while you're starting the answer. So if you recognize that a particular question is based on, let us say, standard of auditing 230 audit documentation, so it is always better that you mention keep it's always better that you mention that that this particular answer pertains to standard of auditing 230 audit documentation. So always try to mention the name and the standard of auditing number while you're attempting that particular question. Second part around company audit, tax audit is something which a lot of people find it relatively easier,